You're welcome to our Erev Shabbat Parashat class. Parashat Tissa, the sin that won't go away, and the punishment that lingers. You obviously know that I'm talking about a sin that is the highlight of our parasha, which is the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. Of course, there's tremendous analysis about the nature of this avon, about the actual, let's say, heavier element of guilt, of what exactly the mistake was, of who made the mistake, of how it could have been made. We are not going to focus on the sin itself of the golden calf and the who and the what and the why. Suffice it to say, it was a tremendous debacle for Am Yisrael, both at the current time, at the time in real time, and for the future. Suffice it to say that we are in shock as to how it could have happened in the aftermath of Ma'amad Har Sinai, when we were essentially a nation of prophets on Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah. We're going to get past all that and really look at more the reaction of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to this terrible sin by our nation. We know, of course, that the initial reaction was absolute annihilation. And by the way, God doesn't exaggerate. It is a misword. There are no idle threats from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When Hashem says, I'm going to do this, it's a decree. When Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, leave me alone, right? And va'achale otam keraga, I'm going to get rid of them right now. It means I've just decreed absolute annihilation of my nation. Let me repeat that word. I'm going to anger on them. I'm going to obliterate them and start again fresh with you. The promise to the forefathers still intact. That is not an idle threat. That is a decree. And Moshe Rabbeinu, in perhaps the most stunning defense, not his last, but the most stunning defense to God argument in the history of the world, Moshe Rabbeinu somehow managed to save the people from obliteration. But if you go a little bit beyond that, and then Moshe Rabbeinu's reaction when he actually saw the scene, and then the Mila Hashem Elai and Shevet Levi, and then who was killed, and then God plagued them a little bit. Let's get beyond that, and let's talk about Moshe Rabbeinu's return to Hashem and his quest for full kapara. Mimachorat, we're in Perek Lamed Bet, chapter 32, Pasuk Lamed, verse 30. He told them the next day, this was a massive sin. Let me go back up. If it's possible, I'll give it a shot. Maybe I can atone for your sin. Moshe goes back up in Pasuk Lamed Aleph, and he says to Hashem, what can I tell you, God? We're exposed. This was a major iniquity, and this is what they did, golden calf. And the famous pasuk, he told them, either you uphold their sin or erase me from the book. And Hashem said in Pasuk Lamed Gimel, listen, I'll erase whoever I want to erase, right? And he said, go back to the people. Pasuk Lamed Dal, let's read that together. Verse 34, go and guide them or point them in the direction that I just told you. I'm going to send a messenger, an angel, a messenger to guide you, which told him that my presence will not be amongst them. And then here's the line we're focusing on. And the day that I remember, and the day that I hold them accountable, they will be held accountable for this sin. And what does that mean? What day is he talking about? What day is he talking about? And Rashi, based on the Gemara, Masechah Sanhedrin, on this pasuk, famously says that whenever unleash retribution to Am Yisrael, whatever avon that they do in the future, there will always be in that punishment a little bit of a sin of Chet HaEgel, I'll read the end of Rashi to you. Ve'en pur'anud ba'a al Yisrael she'en ba'ksad mi'par'on min avon ha'egel. There is no such punishment that will ever befall upon Am Yisrael that within it won't have a portion of the punishment that they're liable for the sin of the golden calf. In other words, I'm going to take this this terrible scene and debacle and guilty act and heavy iniquity of Am Yisrael, the punishment they deserve. I'm going to divide it into 1,000. Just get throwing a number there, and I'm going to give a portion that punishment over history. I'm going to disperse it. That's what I decided to do. Do we ever see such a concept? And says the Ramban on the spot that really this even hints to the galut. In other words, into exile, all the difficulties of Am Yisrael. How could this happen? How could that happen? I'm giving you a little egel stuff right now. Right? That's it's added in the mix right there. They're still paying for it. Wow. Now, if you look at the worst sin that we really committed, which is Heta Meragilim. Why am I calling it the worst? Because an entire generation died off in the desert in the sin of the spies. And Masechet Sanhedrin, the Mishnah, according to one opinion, says that it's sad to say, but that generation was cut off from Olam Haba even, besides those who were under 20. And of course, that date in history was the beginning of the Tisha B'Av, nightmare for Am Yisrael's future history. And yet, it was defined punishment. It was decisive. God got it over with, and it was done. We knew it, we accepted it, we know it, and that's it. And yet, this sin and the punishment for it lingers on. It never ends. Why such a treatment of it? What is unique and what is different about it? And to be sure, if we look in Parashat Eikev, later on, in the 40th year, Moshe Rabbeinu is rebuking the people. This is in Perek Tet in the book of Devarim. And he says, Pasuk Zayin, Zechor al tishkach et asher hiksafta et Adonai Elohecha b'midbar. Never forget, remember, and never forget, says Moshe Rabbeinu to Am Yisrael, what you angered, the way you angered God in the desert, from the day you left Egypt, till today. You've always been rebellious. Now, according to the Ramban, whenever you see the word Zachor, it's actually a positive commandment. The Rambam does not count it, but it's very significant. And in fact, the Hakam, whoever it was at one time, they got together the list of the 10 Zachors that it says in the both Torah and Navi. You have to remember that it's good to recite every single day. Some people do it after prayer. So this is right included. Remember the way that you angered God, except for of course, there's a general remembrance. You know, there's many tests. In fact, elsewhere in Devarim, 10 times you tested me. Hashem said through Moshe Rabbeinu to the people. But here, right after the next pasuk, remember everything you did. It says, Ubchorev tiksavtem et Adonai. Right? Chorev is after Har Sinai, talking about Heta Egel. And there is no less than 13 subsequent Pesukim that describe in detail and elaborate about the Avon. This is Parashat Eikev, the Avon of Heta Egel. You can't even say that about Heta Meragilim, which in Parashat Devarim was elaborated in 3 Pesukim. There's no such elaboration in the Torah. So chief amongst the remembrances of our guilt and mistakes and flaws in the desert is Heta Egel. Never stop remembering. It lingers on. So what gives? And really, I built up to the question, and yet the answer is pretty brief. Maybe not it's obvious, but the answer is based upon a pasuk in the book of Yirmiyah. That's what you're going to guess? A pasuk in the book of Yirmiyah. And Yirmiyah, chapter 2, Perek Bet, pasuk Lamed He, I believe. It says, Yirmiyah, Hashem through the prophet Yirmiyah, Heneni mishpat otach al omrech lo hatati. Interesting. the prophet, with all the rebuke that the prophet had to give, and Yirmiyahu has a lot of rebuke, a lot of comfort, a lot of rebuke also, had to give Am Yisrael. This is at the end of the first Beit HaMikdash. Centuries of fault and errors and sins. He said, I am judging you, says God, on the fact that you said I didn't sin. I'm not judging you on the sin. I'm judging you on the fact that you said you didn't sin. That's what I'm judging you on. The Netibot Shalom, the great Hasidic master, on that pasuk has a mashal, a very simple analogy. The analogy is that someone's walking on the road, and coming towards him is the entourage of the king. Right? In those days, it would be a horse and chariot with others following and preceding. Today, it would be a presidential entourage with cars and black cars and flashing lights. Same thing, right? In any case, but he's going by. And of course, the guy's passing him is from a different political party. He doesn't like this guy, right? So as the king passes, spits at him, right? And everyone's like, about to pounce on this guy. He's like, whoa, slow down. All right, leave him be. The king knows that people are impulsive and act stupidly without thinking. His impulse was that I don't like your views and your policy and your decrees, Mr. King. And he did something stupid, impulsively. Leave him be, said the king. All right, leave him be. Now, a week later, the same person is passing on the very same path, and the very same king passes, and the king's saying, oh, here's that guy. Of course, he's going to show remorse. Of course, and this is his chance. And as he passes him, he doesn't spit again. He looks right at him and gives the king a dirty look. Now the king says, arrest that man. Arrest that man. This is no longer impulsive. And he had plenty of time to think about what he did. He had plenty of time to reflect. This is in a different state of mind, and he's complete denial in terms of his guilt and his error and what he did. He's not conscious of his problem. Now he's guilty. Now get him, said the king. Says Yirmiyah the prophet, Hinani nishpat otech al amurech, says God, I'm judging you not because of your sin, but because you said lo hatati. In the aftermath of your sin, you sinned. We're not perfect. And yet, you could have, after the situation is over, after the test is over, after the impulsive mistake was committed, you could have then reflected. You had consciousness, and you could have had remorse, and you could have changed, and you could have reformed, and you could have repented, and you didn't. And God says, that's why I'm angry. That's why you're going down. And indeed, if we look back at Het HaEgel, and we go turn back to the beginning of Perek Lamed Bet, when it actually happened, and whatever happened, we're not going to analyze it in this class. And we know that they said what they said, and Aharon did what he did, and he threw the gold in the fire, and the Egel came out, and they said, El Elohecha Israel, this is your God that took you out of Egypt. Aaron panics. He said he builds a mizbeach, Hagla Hashem Achad, and it says in Pasuk Vav, Perek Lamed Bet, Vayeshkimu mimachorat. They got up the next morning. The next morning, they had a good sleep. They had a coffee. They read the paper. They're not panicking anymore. The moment of impulse is gone. Vayalu olot vayagishu shulamim vayeshev ha'am le'echol v'shato v'yakumu l'sahak. A lot happened here. There were different sacrifices that were offered, meaning some people seemingly were doing the right thing. The people sat to eat and drink, and they got up to play around. That word doesn't sound good. And many commentators point out that indeed, Am Yisrael wasn't a single body here. There were many different factions, as is normal, the case for our nation, to have many different reactions, some good, some bad. But certainly, there were those, and probably many, I don't know if it's the majority, who held on, dug in to their act and their guilt, and with an incredible, blatant lack of remorse, perpetuated the crime, continued the sin, and said, God, that is it. Everybody sins. Everybody panics. We're flawed. And my nation as well, even though they're the nation of God. I don't expect them to be perfect. And this was a biggie, granted. But the next morning is when I considered and hoped and aspired to their reflection and their change of mind and their alteration of their trajectory and their direction. That should have been. It should have said, Vayeskimu Mahorat, and they said, Ay vey, what have we done? Hineni mishpat otech al omrech lo hatati. It's the aftermath of the sin. That is what I'm concerned about. And that's why Kadosh Baruch Hu said, this will linger on. It will linger on not because it is perhaps as heavy and has the same magnitude of the sin of the spies, but because I want you to remember. I want you to remember how terrible that is. Because when you are going to be thrust into exile, all I expect you to do is correct the faults that got you there to begin with, and not to repeat them. Be conscious of what you've done. Be honest about what changes need to be made. Reflect honestly on Israel. And here, in the same pasuk that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right before it, told Moshe, I'm going to annihilate them, pasuk Tet, he said, Ra'iti et ha'am hazeh v'hineh am kesher oref. I see these people, and I see they're stubborn. Everyone knows that Jews are stubborn, right? But this is the most negative of description. They're stubborn in that they won't allow themselves the moment of consciousness and honesty to reflect. And in that, going fast forwarding to Parashat Eket, where Moshe says, Zechor al tishkach, never forget, and specifically never forget Het ha'egel. There's a sforno, because again, in that whole monologue, few pesukim beforehand, Hashem said, Moshe told them, Ki am oref ata. And that indeed is not a coincidence that is juxtaposed with the next pesukim that describe Het ha'egel. And indeed, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted them to remember, as Forno explains, and he says graphically, it's like a dog that repeats himself. In other words, he keeps throwing up, eating and throwing up the same thing, because every time you did it, I smacked you in the face and I gave you a chance. And again, I gave you a trat, and you wouldn't listen. Am keshir oref means that you refuse to reflect and be honest. The lesson is profound from Het ha'egel to Am Yisrael. What in the world are you waiting for? If you can stop time and freeze frame and reflect on what you've done as a nation, not individuals, as an entire nation, and do what you have to do to reconcile and change and reform and repent, it's all going to stop now, or else it lingers on. Het ha'egel really represents our punishment in this long and difficult exile, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says it's going to linger on. It will continue unless you're honest, you stop, the opposite of kishir odef, of stubborn, you reflect, and you look at me in the mirror, you look at yourself in the mirror and look at me honestly and say, it's time to change, it's time to change. No more het ha'egel, no more punishment, we're on to bigger and better things. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen v'amen. Shabbat shalom.